What's up, everybody? Welcome to another episode of The Right Mindset. I'm Thomas J. Bellezza, and today's live lesson is going to specifically be about doing some exercises to figure out your voice as a writer. So let's get right to it. Let's hit that intro. You can't go wrong with exercises to figure out your voice as a writer. First of all, what is the voice of a writer? How do we even determine that? What are we talking about? Well, your voice as a writer is basically your brand through style. It's the way you use your chapters, even your chapter breaks, the word selections that you choose. But more importantly, there are other elements to your voice that you can do exercises for, basically practicing ways to develop that voice. And yo, what's up? Mr. Jonathan is in the house supporting and celebrating all the goodness of the right mindset. All right. So traditionally, us as writers, we have stories. We get story ideas and we go, we just want to write. And we just write. And over the course of time, you will discover your voice because you'll be writing things that you appreciate and love. Actually, speaking of Jonathan, one of the things he asked me when he first saw me doing outlining exercises and stuff like that on live videos is, do you mostly like to write sci-fi? Since I was working on an alien invasion story, but I was just using it as an example to do the outline. But that's the truth. How your readers see your work becomes part of your voice. It's not the entirety of your voice, but more likely than not, if you're Stephen King, you're Stephen King because you write horror films. But what else? A lot of your stories take place in small towns. What else? There's interdimensional elements to it. What else? There's a sense of innocence, challenged. What else? For some reason, he likes to write about children. A lot. Carrie, high school student. Stand By Me. Kids. But the reason is, if you've read his How to Write book, which I like that the first thing he says is, I don't know how to teach how to write. I'll just talk about how I learned to write. Is a lot of his stories come from his experiences. And the majority of his work began with that world because he was a child and he grew up and he had all these stories and experiences. And, one time he was walking through the woods with his brother. And, that led to his discovery of the idea of what if like kids were in the woods and they found a dead body. So that's Stand By Me. But that's not everything that is your voice. And there are ways to kind of work to find your voice. All right. And we're going to go over that a little bit today. Oh, look at that. That's nice. Look how pretty that is. All right. So before I get right into it, let's... The first thing that you want to do to really get your voice going is you want to determine a point of view, right? So your point of view creatively is sort of like your themes, and more importantly, you might say to yourself, what is it that I observe from life? What is it that I connect with through my life? And what are the things that are important to me? What kind of stories do I really want to tell? And honestly, the first exercise you can create to determine your point of view, right, is you can list out things that you really like, theme wise. For example, do you like found love, right? Or I mean, I like my bullet points. Found love, and you just brainstorm on that. These are things that I started doing later in my career for my own personal stuff because I really wanted to say something, right? That's what a voice as a writer is trying to determine. It's not about just telling stories. When you just write a story, you're missing the fundamental element of being a writer, which is your truth. What is the thing you're passionate about? What are the things you care about? What are the things you're trying to say with your work instead of just being entertaining? Can you just be entertaining? Of course, you could do whatever you want. The reason I'm saying you want to find something important to you from within first is because it adds a little bit more value to what it is you're trying to say. Now, do you have to do what I'm about to do? Not necessarily. But writers that like an R.R. Martin, right? He used to write a lot of sci-fi and like, stuff like that. And then he got into like the darker stuff, and then he went into fantasy. And he found his niche, and he found what he was good at, and he found something he really enjoyed writing, and he stuck to it and worked on it. And that's another exercise that we're going to talk about is, through the process of just writing and discovering what you like per se. So this exercise really is for you to take a little bit more control, take the wheel, one might say, of your career as a writer. Can this change? Yeah. If you discover your point of view or things that are important to you, you're absolutely allowed to change. It's your writing career. The advantage of trying to understand what your point of view and what you're trying to say is that it helps you take your stories that are fundamentally a plot and add some, meat to it. There's a difference between a character who, grew up in a small town and had friends, and it's about them trying to find a school to go to college to. Like, that's a plot. Jacob has a great time with his friends. They make a pact that they're going to try to stay close to each other, even if people move away. And you know what? Now that that's in the plot, someone does move away, and maybe it's the protagonist, and their goal is to end up in the same college as the majority of their, friends. That's a plot. But what are you trying to say with that? What is the fundamental value of your point of view when you're trying to find your voice as a writer? Again, plot would be they grew up, they made a pact, and they says that they want to stay together and friends for as long as possible. So this group decides to go to college together. So no matter if people move away. If that's the plot, what is the point of view? Well, found love. Maybe while they're in college or their goal to get into college, they find love. And, does that pull them away from their vow? And do they choose love over friendship? Or maybe they choose to go to college not because of the vow, but because they realize that they loved one of their friends that are in the circle and everything they're doing, right? So is that also plot, though? It can be plot, but if it's something you're passionate about writing, that you love, found love, or even like, growing pains. I love growing pains. Well, okay, right. Now, me personally, the things I think of is overcoming hardship, uh, bullies, getting their upcomings, um, the weak the weakest person finds their strength. Now, what's interesting about these elements is I also like to challenge those elements. So, what if the weakest person finds their strength um, at the cost of their morality? Okay. Now, what does that ultimately mean? It means that, let's say they're being bullied, right? And then they find, I don't know, the ability to do something like they become a superhero, but then they use their power, their found power, and throughout the story, they actually become the villain, and their struggle is internal, and they have to find their morality to realize that they're going a little further than possible. Now, in storytelling, if that's a part of my voice, Do I always have to tell that same story? No. I can find other ways to tell that story. I could add that character as a sub character. I can make it a subplot. I can, and a bully doesn't have to be, hey, nerd, get over here, or, they beat you up every day. A bully can be an antagonist. So in that case, I want to see my antagonists get their up and comings, right? But also, I like, I'm going to just write what I say. I like, one of my favorite things is philosophical debates on morality of what is right and wrong. I kind of love that debate in itself, right? And if I could see a story come together that challenges that debate, and a great example of that might even be a war, right? There's the good side, quote unquote, and there's the bad side, quote unquote. Well, who is good and who is bad, right? Well, obviously, if we're on one side, we feel the other side is bad. But then you have stories where during World War II, the Germans and the French and stuff like that, they stopped on Christmas time. And I think some of the American soldiers were, and they celebrated Christmas and played, soccer, but it was football. It's called football there. All throughout the Christmas day, and they would dancing and drinking together. And it's like interesting moments like that story I would love to tell. I would love to see that real story come to life and it explored, because there's something philosophically interesting about morality in that, and that helps me determine my point of view. So in this one exercise, we're going to go over a couple exercises. In this one particular exercise, it's good to kind of think about things that interest you. Another thing I really like is found family, and also loyalty. Loyalty is spelt wrong. Is extremely important to me. Loyalty doesn't mean blindly, but loyalty is, do right by others as you would do right by yourself. Don't use people to get ahead. Don't use people as a stepping stone. If you're working with somebody and they end up getting an opportunity to advance their career, obviously go do it. But communicate. Don't just leave them high and dry. Find someone to replace yourself to help the situation. Or, maybe take that situation and say, hey, listen, I got to go do this thing. When I'm done, I'll come back and I will help out. Whatever, but just communicate. If it's like, look, I got to abandon ship, I got this opportunity. This is something I've always dreamed of. I don't even think you have to go into that much. Loyalty is understanding. Loyalty is accepting people for their choices, but you need that communication. You cannot just vanish and do whatever you want and then expect them to understand. All my friends that speak to me and tell me their feelings and their position, I never get mad at it. I never get mad at their position, right? Unless it's, they're obviously saying something ridiculously false, like, the earth is flat. I'm gonna argue that. I'm gonna argue that. All right. Anyway, so this is one exercise you can do. Again, these are my particular, but I just put these as examples. And just kind of write out ideas that are important to you, that interest you, that make you think. And then how can you present those elements into your stories that you're working on? And that is going to help elevate your voice, especially with consistency, since voice is technically your brand through representation. And the representation is the way you format your stories, how you use your chapters. Are they long, short? The way you have your endings to chapters, like, he opens the door and then chapter ends. Like that is a part of your voice, but so is your word choice, so is the character types, so is the genres you like to work in. But these are like little pushings, little cherries on the top to really explore your voice, right? So the other aspect, like I said, uh, is you want to pick and stay consistent with your narrator's point of view. You. What is this? This is, well, you got your first person, third person, limited, third person. And then you have a second person, and there's a couple other ones, but those are very rare though. Omniscient. Do it? No. All great writers have great editors. Oh, what do we got here? Boop. This is a bit of an aside, but if you, as the reader, notice reoccurring themes within an author's work, would you consider that a reflection of who the author is as a person? Me personally, no. And the reason is because what we talk about isn't necessarily who we are. If I write about war, I actually don't agree with war, violence. Do I think it's a necessary evil to maintain the status quo and protect people and help with peace? Absolutely. Do I want to see a world where there is no war, no matter how abstract of an idea that is? Absolutely. But that won't stop me from writing war and exploring war. And I use war as a backdrop to what? To do this, where I explore the philosophical debates of morality. Even like challenging friendship, challenging loyalty, found family, philosophical debates. Like I like to mix and match, right? So to answer your question, Jonathan, no, I do not think the reoccurring themes within a story necessarily dictate who a person is. However, that doesn't mean it couldn't be a reflection of who they are, especially if in conversation you start realizing that their positions, for example, if somebody writes about a flat earth story and you're like, oh, that's crazy. It's a funny story. And then you meet them in real life and they're like, flat earth is a real thing. There's like holes in the sky and those aren't stars. Those fucking whatever they say. Then you're like, all right, well, clearly they're writing about things that they believe in. But art is a reflection of the soul's interest or the mind's interest, but it isn't necessarily a reflection of who the person is on a moral level. Or, as I say, brand is made up of your message. Your message is your missions, morals, and purposes. A mission is the things that you're trying to accomplish in life. Your morals are how you approach those missions, and your purpose is what fuels those missions, right? So if you continue to put that together, that isn't necessarily what you write. Okay, Jonathan says, I agree. I think writer's voice is really just another way of saying it's about developing a personal artistic style and creative. Absolutely. The creative writing element is the artistic approach. And as artists, painters, sculptors, whatever it is, we're exploring the essence of art through these lovely forums, these lovely mediums. And we shouldn't necessarily judge people for what they write about, because they're trying to invoke an emotional. They might not necessarily purposefully be trying to invoke an emotional truth out of the audience, but it creates conversation. And I think real art should create conversation. I mean, I just read an article where a parents took their kid out of a school because the teacher ended up quitting because they were like, I'm done with this. Ultimately, the parent got mad, the parents, because the teacher was teaching an art class in middle school, and they were talking about the statue of David, and the parents said that they were exploiting the children by showing them porn. So, crazy. All right, anyway, let's get back to it. So the second exercise is pick and stay consistent with your narrative's point of view. Do you have to mainly stay third person, first person? Not really. But this is an exercise to try to discover your voice. Now, a technique that I did a lot of when I was coming up, and only because of some advice that was given to me from other writers when I was delving in away from scripts into novels, is that take your first page of whatever it is you end up writing and write it in different narrative point of views. 1 second. What do we got? Jonathan says he's a grower, not a That's right. He is a grower. not a shower. Poor David has a very small schmeckle. If anyone doesn't know, schmeckle is Yiddish for schmeckle. All right. Narrative point of view. The exercise I do, and I still do it to today, just to see if the story feels better. I might take the up to the fifth page, but if I'm working on a story, then I'm trying to find the narrative's voice of that story and see where I can tell the best version of the story. I'll take that first page I wrote, first full page, not this chapter design, and then like it starts. No, your first full page before you do all your formatting and your prettiness, and I'll write it in different narrative point of view. So I'll write it in first person, third person, limited, omniscient, and second person. What's the big difference? First person is within the mind of one individual, usually the protagonist. The third person limited is that we're actually following from a particular perspective of, normally it's the protagonist, but we're slightly outside them. So we're not necessarily hearing their thoughts of them going, I can't believe Amaline told me that about her father. Like, we're not hearing that, but you can be like, Kressif. Let's just make up crazy fantasy names. Kressif is hesitant on believing Amadish's words, right? So that's a little bit more limited. We understand what they're feeling, and we kind of understand their head, but we're not necessarily listening to their thoughts. Limited also might only allow us to see what the protagonist sees. So we might, as a narrative, not write that, Cretius walks into a room and sees a rod of healing and realizes, this rod of healing was once held by the mighty Tarok, whatever. That wouldn't be limited. And the reason is because the limited narrative point of view is usually from whatever the protagonist knows. Which brings us to omniscient, which is basically God's narrative. They have sometimes are found having personalities, whereas third person limited would have more of a non-biased personality, and first person narrative. The narrative would have the personality of the protagonist, whereas third person would be a non-biased narrative, watching and observing through their eyes of what the protagonist is doing. Third person omniscient could have a personality. They don't have to have a personality. However, they are aware of not only what the audience sees, the character sees, but what is not present. And those are the things where, if you're reading a Lord of the Rings book and he's going off on the history of a branch, that's omniscient, right? Now, second person is an interesting way of doing a narrative as if the reader is the character. This is the I, right? Not you or he, right? Or, Chris does whatever. No, this is second person is absolutely as if you are the story. Let me get an example for you. It's the like you do this, you are doing that, right? So a simple example is you walked across a bridge. You would be a use of second person. So if somebody is reading the story, it would be that way. You like if it's a fantasy book, it's like you hold your sword as tight as you can against the forces of evil, but it might not necessarily go directly into your head and think, but you could. But second person is a pretty hard narrative to write, and very rare, but it is done. People do it. So the exercise that I'm talking about is take your first page or up to 5 pages of what you wrote and try it in different narrative points of views to see what you feel comfortable writing. I'm working with an author right now, and she traditionally writes in first person because that naturally comes out of her, but she doesn't like writing in first person. So she's practicing how to write more third person limited. So she can still sort of have that first person element to it, but be outside the character. She doesn't like being so intimately in, but she also writes in present tense. So these are choices too, present and past tense, etc., etc. That's all part of your voice. Um, so she's been doing that. She's been allowing herself to write as she does, and then taking it and then editing it to feel more third person, which means you got to change a lot of the perspectives or terminology and pronouns, etc., etc. All right. Okay. 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 Now, another element, all right, this of finding your voice is think about your sentence structure and word choices. Oh yeah. This is a fundamental element of your voice is obviously there are some writers out there that use a lot of the same terminology. For example, you may or may not notice that in Game of Thrones, a fortnight is thrown around far often, too often than it should be. Everything's a fortnight. Well, we'll be there in a fortnight. Your birthday is a fortnight. You know, like everything is fortnight. What we got here, Jonathan? I think first person perspective is more. Uh, oh yes, it is. So what's going on here is first person allows an author to kind of almost throw themselves into the character. I would almost push back on that, Jonathan, saying that. Oh wait, what do we got? That comment has no connection to the previous one. FYI. For your information, I'm going to push back a little bit in saying I don't think it is necessarily the first person perspective uh, that allows somebody to be susceptible to the self inserts. Though I don't think it's too far fetched to say that um, authors will place themselves into a story when the character itself has a lot of the elements of the writer. Um, the only thing that I would say to that is I don't understand why people are a little pushy when they say like, "Oh, this is self-inserted." Like that's funny to me. Like it's story. We see ourselves as something greater or bigger, and we want to experience that. So I think it's okay that we let ourselves out and explore worlds, new worlds. Like, how would I be in this world? If you're a big Dungeons and Dragons person or a role playing person, obviously, if you're an author, you're like, oh, if I was a barbarian, how would it be? Um, I don't feel it's a faux pas. I don't feel it's a negative thing if a writer throws themselves in there. I think self inserts are pretentious when you turn yourself into a Mary Stew or a Gary Stew. You know, like that's, you know, like I get that. Um, I actually have a self insert in my world. The main character Telmo Altanian is based on a character that I portrayed on stage when I used to play music back in the day, and our stories revolved around this character who is the first god of that world and is the god of all things, the god of consciousness and existence. So in my novels, I always place that character in there one way or another, sort of as like I'm the narrator and I'm watching the world. And since I usually write in third person omniscient, I allow that narrative to sort of almost have that voice. But uh another element is I have a character named Flexus Gray Eye, and I'll usually do the narratives in his voice because he's the story holder. He's the guy who collects all the world's history, and he places it in like this large book of history and stuff like that. Uh, one second, I'm sorry. Okay, all right. What is Jonathan saying here? What we got? What we got? In other words, it may be difficult to distinguish the difference between what the character would do in a particular situation versus what the author would do. Well, you know, again, if you know who the author is, like if your friend writes a book and you're reading it and you're like, oh, that's exactly what my friend would choose to do, versus you seeing your friend as the character because they wrote the book, but they're making choices that aren't necessarily who they are. And an interesting element to that is, let's say an author inserts themselves into a character and the character is an amazing swordsman, but they themselves have no knowledge of fighting with a sword, but they picture them, you know, to distinguish the difference between what the character would do is the character would use the sword because they're well versed in the sword, whereas the author, without the knowledge of the sword, would run, quickly, as fast as possible, the other way. So, um, but again, if you don't know the author personally, who cares? It's a character, it's a story. Uh, but that's my personal opinion. Now, obviously, if you don't like self inserts, there's nothing wrong with that either. That's the brilliance of having an opinion. So think about your. Let's go back to the story structure and word choice. So how does your sentences, um, your story structure, really influence that? Uh, you know, my grammar and my spelling is not immaculate, as you can see, and I will always stand by the great writers have great editors statement. But the way we use phrasing, you know, the worlds we create, like the wealthy worlds versus the poor worlds versus, maybe the common land, they're all going to have different dialect, different phrasings or regional phrasings, things like that. And that also should come out in your sentence structure and word choices. Yeah, but the ones you choose, will they curse? Will they not curse? Will you as a writer allow the main character to not always be the focal point? Would you allow sub characters to kind of have more of a distinct voice, whereas the protagonist is more like just getting us through the story? Every little element from a long sentence to a short sentence is going to be a part of that discovery of your particular sentence structure. All right. So, what kind of exercises can you do with that? The main exercise is work your sentences and word choices. This doesn't mean go to thesaurus.com and try to find an alternate word that's bigger and smarter. It just means if you want to have a greater vocabulary, study words, work on words. If you want to have a more elegant sentence structure, or as it's known, purple prose, work on that. Work on making it fancy. Do I recommend purple proses everywhere? No, but you need some of them. Just like you need description, you need exposition. You need to tell, but you need to show more. But you also need to allow the audience to know what's going on. Sometimes you have to go, we have only 30 minutes till the bomb goes up. Like, you need that occasionally. What we got here? Jonathan says on the topic of self-insert, it's really not so much a value judgment upon self-inserts, but in terms of developing a skill in characterization, I think third person is easier for creating personalities that are distant. That's a position. Because again, third person is distant, just in structure. I think this is again opinion. I think a strong writer could take any narrative point of view and present a strong character just because they did their work. They did their character work. Any character that comes into a story and they have no missions, morals, or purpose will sort of fall short into what I call things happening man or woman. They're just characters. They're NPCs that just things have to happen. So they're there to make those things happen. But I know that if you understand what a character's missions in life are, their morals and how they present those missions and the purpose of how their missions are fueled, you'll have a more rounded character. I don't think you need to go into extreme character development where you're like, what's their favorite color? What's their backstory from the moment they were born till now? Like, I don't think you have to go into that, but it also helps to figure out how do they serve the story and how can we move around the story to explore them. And through that, you'll develop a stronger characterization despite first person or third person or second person. As far as the self-insert goes with that, honestly, I think we self-insert everything. Because again, the things we're interested in, even if we don't believe it. Again, I don't believe in violence and war, but I write about war. the self-insert is my philosophy on war, meaning I present the part that I find vile as true as I possibly can, and then I attack that truth with philosophy or you know uh, objection. And so in a sense, we're always inserting ourselves. The way a villain, quote unquote, acts is going to have a sense of our interest. But if you're a good writer, you don't even have to be a great writer, but if you're a good writer, you can take your personal philosophies and not allow it to become a biased response to why a villain wins or loses or why they think or why they do anything. But personally, like my antagonists usually have a deep philosophy, or usually have, in a sense, are not evil, though they do evil things at times, right? Because evil is really just a deciding factor of culture and nature. But so I don't. I mean, I'm not saying this is wrong. What you're saying, Jonathan. I'm just saying I don't believe the point of view has an extreme influence on the self-insert. But I do believe all authors self-insert some value of who they are, even if it's their opposition, where they're like, I don't believe in this, but I need it to be as true as possible, so I'm going to put it in there, and then I'm going to challenge that and take it to the next level. But anyway, so the third exercise to think about your structure and word choices to find your voice. And this comes down to when you're writing, instead of looking at thesaurus.com, like I was saying, if you want to have more of a vocabulary or use of vocabulary, just study vocabulary words. As far as sentences go, play with them. Play with how you write sentences. It's like when you first rode a bike. You just want to be able to stay on the bike. I know you have dreams and aspirations of doing wheelies, jumping off of ramps, and flipping and spinning and alley-oops, but you just want to stay balanced on the bike. So when you first start writing, you're going to just be balanced on the bike, and you're going to get the sentences out however you get the sentences out. But to work and find your voice as a writer utilizing sentence structure and word choices, you practice. Even if you're not writing a real story, practice. Write a paragraph out. Just let it flow out of you. Don't put a lot of thought into it. Just train a thought it, and then go through each sentence and think about how else you would write that sentence. Think about, maybe I can make this sentence 2 sentences. Maybe I could take this first sentence and turn it into a paragraph. Maybe I could take the second sentence that I had originally and turn that into a paragraph. How do I expand these moments? And you'll start learning different ways to use sentence structures, lengths of sentences. A good exercise with sentence structure is try to write quick, rapid sentences. Quick, he ran to the door, even though like it's not fancy. He's just practicing. He ran to the door. The door was locked. He hears screams. They hear screams on the other side. And now you're creating pace. But then you're like, maybe I want to slow it down. So he ran to the door. The door is locked. They hear voices. They hear screams on the other side. They take a moment and look around to explore the room as they discover a lack of tools to break through this door. Right? Whatever. If you felt that, it's boom, boom, boom. Oh, this door is stopping me. There's urgency, but instead the character has a moment of pause, and they're thinking logically, and they're not being rushed by the anxiety of the scene. So now the sentence structure actually slows down, and now we get a moment with the character. All right. So what else do we have? Oh, yeah. Okay. You want to find a balance between descriptions. Oh, let me write that. I have my notes, but I know. Find a balance between descriptions and dialogue. That's right. Okay. So there are long passages and descriptions. Obviously, we could sit here for days and be like, he held his phone, the V40 VDR, Android that it's black with a protector. Like, you can go into that and really go into description. But your style, your voice is based on how descriptive you are versus how much dialogue you have versus, the mixture of it. How do they flow in and out? Something that I really like is dialogue, because I come from screenplays. That was, I started with screenplays, and I like dialogue to work through the characters. But what I do is, in my first draft or even my first extended outline, I'll go dialogue heavy to discover the characters, their motivations, things like that. I have an idea of who the characters are, but I allow conversation to kind of dictate their positions. And then when I work and clean up my books on the second round, I'll actually clean up the dialogue to where the dialogue is almost deleted, and it's their behavior that becomes, or I create a deeper subtext to sometimes what is spot on dialogue, because I know in my first draft that's not my last draft. So I'm okay where I get to a point where I don't know what I want to say, uh where it comes out, fancy per se, but I do know what I need to have said. So I'll have a part where a character might say, I don't trust you right now. Everything that you've come up with is not something I'm willing to take a chance on. And then when I go back to my second draft, how do I turn that into behavior or a shorter or more subtextual dialogue? And that's when I clean it up. What's this? Jonathan says, an understanding of formats matters too. For instance, short form fiction requires brevity. Well, yeah, I mean, that comes down to how you use chapters. Is a chapter long, short? Are you using chapters to create suspense? How do you use your chapter breaks? How do you use your soft chapter breaks, your hard chapter breaks? This is all part of the method of your voice and discovering, for sure. But back to find a balance between description and dialogue. So how do we practice this? Again, you want to work on structure. Work on structure within your paragraphs or pages. Again, just like working your sentences and words, this is an example of where you can write out a page, a couple paragraphs, and then go through it and say to yourself, do I have enough? Excuse me. Sorry about that. What the? Phantom coughs. All right. I'm sorry. Whereas sentence and word structure might be where you're just looking at the sentences and you're trying to say it in a different way. Description and dialogue. I even want to add position in there. Description, exposition, dialogue. So we know that dialogue is what we're saying. Well, the characters are saying, hey, how are you? I'm pretty good. Hey, nice shoes, nice face. All right. Right. Exposition is we have 30 minutes before the bomb goes off. And description, also, hey, I'm from, the planet of Wolfhoff. Anyway, and descriptions really goes through what we're seeing. He's, Clarence stands there at 6'2" with a bushy beard, right? That's the description. If you read through your first page or even a paragraph and you find yourself realizing that it's a white room, meaning like we don't have any geography or environment, you got to add some description. If by the end of that page we don't know what's going on other than what the characters are saying, there's not enough exposition. Even if that exposition, I call it character exposition. So there's audience exposition, which is we have 30 minutes before the bomb goes off, and character exposition, which is a term that I've created, where the characters create the information through dialogue and behavior, right? So it's not just a chunk of we got 30 minutes, right? Or my least favorite is when an intelligent character says something and then a dumb character says, can you explain that for us dumb people? Which is really the audience needs to know. And then they explain it simply for the exposition. Anyway, and then again, dialogue. If you look at your page, is it all dialogue? Is there not enough dialogue? What is the dialogue saying? And this helps you find a balance between the description, exposition, and dialogue, which is a part of your voice as a writer. If your pages are missing or have very little description, exposition, or dialogue within it, that's your voice, and that will affect you. Oh, what we got here? Hello, Ruth. Sorry, I've been lurking. I'm here too. Hello, Ruth. Welcome. I'm glad you've been lurking. Thank you for participating. Woohoo! All right. Oh, you know what I just realized? I have it on the screen. I'm sorry about that. So again, find a balance between description, exposition, and dialogue. And this is the work part. I don't recommend doing this on your first draft, nor do I recommend doing it during your extended outlines. I highly recommend it during your second draft when you're going through your book and rewriting, doing your first rewrite. Is, it's not just about reading the pages. It's about putting the work in. And part of that work is analyzing your sentences, analyzing your point of views, analyzing everything we have here. So are your themes and subjects, are the things that are important to you present on the pages, not in 10 pages, but does every page have something, an element, a crumb of evidence to the things that are important to you? Is your narrative point of view very present? And when it comes to your sentences and word choices, do you feel there's a consistency to what you want to say and how you want to say it? Are there sentences that feel weak? Work those sentences. And of course, one of the big things is the structure with your paragraphs. And the description, exposition, dialogue, to me, is probably where I do the most work, because I like to kind of fly through my first draft to get the story out, especially after I did all the work with the outline. And I make sure that I'm describing things, that the white room vanishes, that or becomes where they are. I make sure my exposition is more character exposition than it is audience exposition. But if I know it's not clear, I'm okay with putting something in there, not a lot, but something that creates the exposition for the story to make sense, which takes us to the dialogue. Again, I love dialogue, and I know I can go heavy with it. So that is something I look for, because I don't want my voice to be filled with that dialogue. I want my dialogue to be subtextual. I want my dialogue to have purpose. So there is a difference between, hey, we have to get to blank, blank, blank in 30 minutes, so the bomb is going to blow up, versus creating sort of like a relationship between the characters of that urgency through dialogue or lack of dialogue. And I think that has a little bit more power. Everyone say hi. Woohoo. I like when everyone talks to one another in the chat room. Okay. I have one more exercise you could do, and which will help you discover your voice right as often as you can. Now, to me, this is not all the time, but when you can, right? So these are writing sessions, right? Or blocks. This is waiting for the bus or on the subway. Even your emails, right? So I don't know what that word was. Even your emails, like anything, your texts, anything you write, allow that to be a chance to practice. When I was in the music industry, one of the things that used to always blow my mind, especially when I was talking to like producers or record label execs, they're like, I don't understand why bands would only practice their guitar or drums when they were rehearsing for a show instead of practice, because like a great writer practices writing, just like even musically, like giving yourself exercises. When I was in the band, I still do it today, kind of too. I'll give myself thresholds and limitations. I'll be like, all right, I want to write a song that has a specific groove with no choruses, but I want it to still be interesting. I want to write a song that has a strong music instrumental middle. I want to write a song, whatever. And it's the same thing with writing. You know, you have to write when you're not writing, and what that means is I shouldn't be practicing how to write only when I'm writing my stories. I should be practicing how to write things that I feel I need work on. If I need work on descriptions, I'll write descriptions out. I'll look around the room and I'll work on describing what I see, what I feel, what I hear, what I taste, what I'm experiencing. Just as an exercise. The same thing with exposition. You know, if I feel my exposition is too on the nose, or I don't know how to do character exposition, I'll write out exposition as straightforward as possible. And then I like to kind of dissect it and say to myself, how would someone react to this, or create this emotionally, or behave to this, or speak it with dialogue where it's not so right on the nose, but still informative, or as I like to call it, vague but informative. Um, and the same thing with dialogue. You know, when I sometimes, especially when I would go out, like when I was in the comedy scene, I filmed a lot of behind the scenes stuff with my friends and everything. And then I would go home and I would actually listen to, because we would we'd say a lot of crazy stuff, and a lot of it turned into jokes, and or we'd make a joke or an observation. So I would listen to it in that sense. And the way I wrote my comedy was dialogue. It was, I didn't write jokes. I wrote dialogue and how it came out, and I would create these characters who were based on the situation. And I would create different voices and I would do those characters. But that followed me into writing. So I like to listen to how people talk, and I observe what is sort of like, you know, that whole, well, I can't think of the word now, but the, hey, how are you doing? I'm doing all right. All right. Small talk. So like, I hear that and I go, I never want to hear that in a book, because we need to get right to the information. What's Ruth saying here? Let's see. Ruth says, I've been practicing writing subtext for the past year. It's tough. That's awesome, though, that you're putting that time in. And, that I think is a great strength in people, when we recognize and take accountability to areas we feel we need work on. And I'm going to use the word weakness as a sense of, we understand that and we want to make it a strength. And I think that's beautiful, Ruth. Not only that you're sharing that with us, but you're taking the time to really work on something that you want to improve in. And also, subtext is tough. It is. It's definitely a tough thing to do. Just to give you some advice on that, since you brought it up, remember, everything should start with the clearest understanding, and then obviously breaking that down to how crazy vague can you get with something. And I think that's the fun exercise with that, and which brings us again to exposition and descriptions, to the other exercise where it's like, I know what I need to say, so I'm just going to write it as face value as possible, and then trying to get those things. Another fun thing about subtext is we use it all the time as people in real conversation. And if you pay attention to it, you'll start hearing it and you'll say, oh, that's interesting how that was presented. I understand that my friend was uncomfortable talking about this thing, and their behavior became jokey, and they did that. Oh, that was an interesting, trigger reaction, which that's what it is. It's like psychology, a behavioral response to alter the situation is a trigger reaction, which isn't a negative thing. It's just like, it's just like I make jokes when I'm uncomfortable. That's a trigger. If I'm uncomfortable, the trigger is that I'm uncomfortable. So then I react with humor. I like making jokes. I don't, but anyway. All right. So write as often as you can, but don't write when you write. Meaning, find the time, just like Ruth showed us, is find the time to really work on things that you want to get better at or explore. Study the concept, study what is a description, what makes a description great. And the thing is, like, if you only practice when you write, you're not necessarily working on that skill, though writing is practice in general. Like, obviously, if you're riding a bike and you can ride it without training wheels, you're still learning continuously how to ride a bike. You're improving your ability to ride a bike. But if I wanted to ride with no hands, I wouldn't just go, well, I'm going out with my friends today. I'm going to ride my bike and I'm not going to use my hands. No, I'm going to go out by myself and ride around with no hands. And then when I'm with my friends, I will also use no hands, etc., etc., etc. And that's one of the secrets to really discovering your voice is it's not always about working on a project to discover your voice. It's okay to put the work in to discover your voice. And as we said, we'll simplify. Determine your point of view, really what's important to you, your missions, morals, and purposes. So basically, the things you want to accomplish in the world or that are important to you as far as like, for example, I don't think bullies. I think bullies are terrible. So mission for me would be like to eradicate the bully environment, or I think people. I love this theme in my stories: teamwork, is connected to found family, which is up there. Um, and together we win. Uh, right. So I like that element in there. And, that's something I believe in too. I believe that people working together has a better outcome than us always competing with one another. So that's something I like to do it. You want to find your narrative and really stick with it. Can you change a narrative? Absolutely. But the more you really learn your strengths within the narrative that helps you say what you want to say, you might want to stick with that. And people will get comfortable with your books. They'll know when they read your books, your novels, or your stories, they know what they're getting into. But if every book is a different narrative and every book has different uh, intent, like if I released like a romance novel and then my next book was like a horror novel, and then my next book was a sci-fi, and then my next one was epic fantasy, and then my next one was like a thriller. My audiences know my voice. I move around into these different genres, but in those genres, what they will stay familiar with is my point of view. The narrative point of view will be consistent. So now I'm allowed to jump genres, right? And then the same thing with my story structures. They know when they read my books, there's going to be a certain feel to how I write and a certain feel to the way I describe things, the way I use exposition and dialogue, etc. And then, of course, I write all the time. What do we got? Oh, Jonathan. Jonathan says, Thomas, you have the nicest beard I have ever seen on any man. I mean that from one friend to another. Thanks, Jonathan. Oh, he actually wrote some. I don't remember if I brought it up before, but vignettes, which is not what you put on salads, can be a helpful writing exercise for honing in on a particular style or technique, like writing a scene with the setting being the focus, etc., etc. I agree with that. That's just an extended version of writing a page or a paragraph, taking a paragraph and then turning every sentence within that paragraph into a paragraph. A vignette is just another threshold or limitation that you give yourself. Again, the limitation is instead of writing a short story or an epic novel, you're writing a vignette, fun story, quick story. I was working on a show. It never got made, but we were developing it, and it was called The Circle, whatever. And the show was actually written in vignettes, and there were 6 characters in the show, and each character got a vignette per episode. And the main story took place in the circle, which was a therapy session, and then we would follow the other characters in their vignettes. And you could either watch just the main circle story with the vignettes through a series, and it would be that character's full story. But if you watch them and like another character, like the story actually kind of grows, and so forth and so forth. Vignettes are a fun exercise, and we actually wrote the show with the vignettes being a limitation as an exercise, and it just created a very fun experience for us as a writing team. And that was a fun show to kind of work on, and we got pretty far with it. Actually, we got 6 studios were interested. It was during the time where I ended up having to have surgery, and I went through all my cancer stuff, so like everything kind of imploded. But it was exciting. Oh, Ruth says, when I just want to write something for fun, I take a reference in my story and write that scene out. Like the time my now 47-year-old character found a dog when he was supposed to. Oh, I love that, Ruth. That's really awesome. And are you saying you won't use that secondary story exercise in the main story? If so, that's awesome too. I kind of like that because you're exploring the characters. Ruth continues, or he mentioned that he was in therapy, and I couldn't help but think his therapy session would be comedy gold. It was. That's a fantastic exercise in writing right there. Taking your main story and finding some passionate excitement to jump in and work on secondary ideas from that, like offshoots, almost like you could create a whole new world, a whole new story from that experience. So that's pretty fun. And that, so Ruth says, for anyone who listens to the audio stuff only, yeah, I don't use any of those side stories just for fun. I think that's even more exciting because like you're putting so much effort into the development of the character that it's going to shine in that character in the main story, and I think that's pretty fantastic. Fantastic. All right. So before I go, as always, does anyone have any questions on what we went over and why we went over it? If not, I think it's fair to say that we're going to call it a day. I hit my hour threshold. But I'm happy to answer any questions. I love that we had people staying, people talking. That makes me happy. I'm going to take a sip of drink while the chat room catches up. Anything but the truth. Sing once again with me a strange duet. My power over you grows stronger yet. And though you turn away to glance behind. Okay. That's all you get. That's it. I'm probably going to get in trouble by YouTube. Hey, you can't use that. But, all right. So, final thoughts, and we'll call it a day. I guess I have to put the thing up, right? Final thoughts. Look at it, so pretty. All right. My final thoughts is anytime you're trying to find your voice, remember it comes from you, not the audience. When you're writing, don't write for an audience. Write for you and allow your audience to find you. Same thing when you do stand-up comedy or you write music. If you're writing jokes for the audience, you won't find your voice as a comedian. If you write songs that only audiences like, you're not going to be able to have a voice in that music. Take time to develop your voice. It's okay if you've already released several books because it's going to take many books for you to discover your voice. And you don't necessarily have to write books to discover your voice. You can work on your voice, and when you find it, you can start adding that to your novels. What is the value of a voice? I'll say it again and again, over and over. The value of your voice is that people connect to your emotional perspectives. Your brand's message, the missions, morals, and purposes is what helps audiences connect to you. Not that they necessarily are your personal views. They don't have to be. They're just subjects that people relate to, and they go, I like reading this person's book. They have another one coming out. I know that I'm going to get certain subjects or philosophies that I appreciate, so I'm going to buy their book. All right. With that said, Jonathan says, you already answered mine. Will you be doing another live stream next weekend? I will, actually. Monday or Tuesday, I'll upload the premiere dates. I'm definitely going to do it this Saturday coming up and continuing, but the subject matters, I have to kind of put a little thought into it over the weekend. The next video will be a continued version of my process as a writer. So I have the series where how I write my novels. That next video is coming out, and then the following week will be another sort of like real time explanation. So I'm glad I answered your question. I would love to know what your question was that I answered, unless it was the question you had asked in the comments. Ruth says, "Voice is such a complex subject. I appreciate the insights." I'm grateful you're here to appreciate it. So thank you for being interested in listening today and hearing me and giving me your time. I'm glad that I was able to shed some light on some things. And remember, it's just, these are things that I have learned. These are my perspectives on it. I always recommend doing research and expanding into other perspectives so you can develop something that more or less is your point of view on it. And I agree. Voice is complex, and it's very prevalent though when you read a book from I call them baby authors, right? So a baby author writing their first book for the first time versus say their book, their seventh book, and you could see their voices develop. And I mean, if you look at Stephen King with Carrie, and then you look at Stephen King now, you can tell that he's absolutely, without a doubt, developed a voice that is quite honed in comparison to his original works. So that's always interesting. All right. With that said, if you haven't already, and if you're new to this channel and you're jumping on or seeing this video for the first time and you like what you heard, please subscribe to the channel, The Right Mindset. It really helps. My only questions to you is, as with the voice, what is it that you personally have point of views on? What is it that you like to talk about in your stories? What are the subjects, the thoughts, and the ideas that really fuel your stories? Ultimately, I'm saying, what is your brand? What is your missions, morals, and purposes? The stories that come to you where you're like, I love telling stories about X, Y, and Z. I want to hear about that, because maybe you'll find out that you're not alone in this community of writers. Others love those subjects too. So again, until next time, keep developing the right mindset. I'll see you next time. Bye.